Welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a place where the quiet mysteries of the universe and the soft rhythm of science help you drift peacefully into sleep. This channel explores the universe with curiosity and care, turning complex science into calm stories for the restless mind. Tonight, we journey far into Earth's ancient past, to a time when dinosaurs did not yet thunder across the land, and the skies were ruled by something far stranger. Birds, not bats, not dragons, but insects so massive that today they would seem like creatures from a dream or a nightmare. Giant dragonflies with wingspans wider than a falcon's, beetles with bodies the length of a child's forearm, and centipedes as long as a car door crawling beneath fallen logs. Thank you for watching this video. And if by chance our adventure keeps you awake instead of putting you to sleep, we apologize. Please consider liking, sharing, and commenting where you're listening from and what time of night it is. Now, let us begin the quiet descent into an Earth long before humanity, long before mammals, long before even dinosaurs, to a forgotten age when insects ruled the skies. More than 300 million years ago, Earth existed in a different rhythm. The continents were not in their current places, but locked together in the slow-motion formation of a future supercontinent. This was the Carboniferous period, spanning from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago. The atmosphere, temperature, vegetation, and life forms were unlike anything the modern world remembers. In the still, damp forests of towering lycopods and ferns, life flourished under a canopy darkened by endless leaves, and it was here that arthropods, including insects, millipedes, and spiders, thrived beyond what would be considered ordinary today. The Carboniferous is best known for its vast, swampy forests that would one day become the coal beds of the modern industrial age. These forests stretched across low-lying landmasses, forming an unbroken green sprawl that thrived in warm, humid conditions. The oxygen levels during this period are estimated to have been as high as 35%, significantly more than the current 21%. This increase in atmospheric oxygen is a crucial key to understanding why the insects of this period could grow to such enormous sizes. Oxygen fuels respiration, and with a higher oxygen concentration, the physical limitations on insect size, which today restricts their growth due to the inefficiency of passive gas exchange, were lifted. In the dappled light of these primeval forests soared the dragonfly-like Meganeura, one of the most iconic representatives of this age, with wingspans reaching up to 70 centimeters. Roughly the width of a modern hawk, Meganeura was a predator of the air. Its compound eyes scanned the forest floor for prey, likely smaller insects and perhaps early amphibians. Its wings were rigid, supported by a dense framework of veins, and beat in a silent rhythm above the treetops. Unlike modern dragonflies, that require specific aquatic conditions for reproduction, Meganeura was adapted to the widespread wetlands of the Carboniferous with near-limitless resources. Yet Meganeura was not alone. On the forest floor, creatures such as Arthroplura, a millipede-like arthropod, slithered through decaying plant matter. Arthroplura could reach lengths of over 2 meters, making it the largest known land invertebrate. In Earth's history, its many legs carried its armored body slowly across the moist detritus, and although it may look terrifying by modern standards, fossil evidence suggests it was likely a detritivore, feeding on rotting vegetation rather than hunting other animals. Higher in the forest, thick branches were home to enormous cockroach-like insects. Fossils from the Carboniferous include Polyodixiopter, a now extinct order of insects with long beak-like mouthparts and 3 pairs of wings, one of which may have been used more for stabilization than flight. These insects varied in size, with some species reaching wingspans of up to 50 centimeters. They represent an early experiment in flight, predating the evolution of birds and bats by hundreds of millions of years. The flora of this age also contributed to the unique ecosystems in which these insects thrived. Plants like lepidodendron and sigillaria dominated the swampy landscapes. These were giant club masses and spore-producing trees that could grow over 30 meters in height. Their fallen trunks provided shelter and breeding grounds for various insect species, while their decaying matter created a rich layer of soil teeming with microbial life and small arthropods. Predators during the Carboniferous were few, and vertebrates had not yet developed into dominant land dwellers. The absence of birds and larger reptiles allowed insects and their relatives to explore evolutionary paths unchallenged. The early tetrapods of the time, amphibian-like creatures with sprawling limbs and primitive lungs, were tied closely to water and did not yet possess the speed or agility to outcompete the giant insects. In this world, insects ruled not only in number, but in form and function. The skies were quieter then, filled not with birdsong, but with the faint hum of chitinous wings. The air was heavy, moist, and rich in scents from decaying vegetation. In this dense atmosphere, flying insects had a tactical advantage, gliding from tree to tree, moving with ease across the shadowed forest canopy. The wings of Carboniferous insects were often translucent with dark veining, resembling stained glass. Each movement, each beat of their wings, echoed an evolutionary innovation that would be refined and repeated for hundreds of millions of years to come. The fossil record from this period is astonishingly detailed thanks to the fine-grained sediments of ancient lake beds and swamp deposits. These environments were perfect for preserving delicate features like wing structures and body segmentation. Fossil sites in what is now Europe and North America have revealed a spectrum of insect diversity, from tiny bristletails to massive griffinflies, painting a picture of a thriving ecosystem where insects occupied nearly every ecological niche. The increased oxygen levels of the Carboniferous, while providing the advantage of gigantism, also had broader ecological effects. Fires were more common, sparked easily by lightning due to the high flammability of oxygen-rich air and dry plant matter during seasonal transitions. These fires would have swept through the underbrush, clearing vegetation and influencing plant-insect dynamics. Some species likely evolved traits to survive or escape these periodic infernos, contributing to the arms race between flora and fauna. Meanwhile, insects were already engaging in complex behaviors. Evidence suggests that some species formed swarms, displayed primitive forms of mating rituals, and even built burrows or nests. Fossilized trackways show patterns of movement, group coordination, and interaction with the environment. These behaviors laid the groundwork for the incredible diversity and adaptability that insects would continue to demonstrate throughout Earth's history. The dominance of giant insects did not last forever. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, changes in the Earth's climate and oxygen levels began to challenge their supremacy. But that turning point lies further along the timeline. For now, we remain within the still shadows of this ancient world, where wings rustled like leaves, and the land belonged to invertebrates. The reign of giant insects across the Carboniferous world was not a sudden event, but the gradual outcome of millions of years of evolutionary pressures, atmospheric changes, and ecological opportunities. The absence of large terrestrial vertebrates, combined with a dense, oxygen-rich atmosphere and an abundance of plant matter, created the ideal circumstances for arthropods to explore new niches. The story of this ancient world continues deep within the humid forests and still wetlands, where insects did not simply survive, they engineered a realm of their own. To understand the persistence of insect gigantism, we must explore how their bodies functioned in this unique atmosphere. Insects do not breathe through lungs. Instead, they rely on a network of small tubes called trachea that transport oxygen directly from the environment to their internal tissues. This passive diffusion system works efficiently only over short distances. In today's 21% oxygen environment, this limits the maximum size most insects can achieve. However, in the Carboniferous atmosphere, where oxygen levels reached up to 35%. This system allowed for far greater body sizes. The increased partial pressure of oxygen enabled the tracheal system to deliver sufficient oxygen to support much larger insect bodies without the need for active respiration. This physiological adaptation allowed not only for size, but also for complexity. Insects of this period began to exhibit a range of specialized appendages, mouthparts, and behavioral traits. Some evolved piercing sucking mouthparts, allowing them to tap into plant juices or perhaps the body fluids of other invertebrates. Others developed mandibles powerful enough to slice through thick vegetation or exoskeletons. Fossilized jaws and leg spurs hint at insect-tonisect predation, an ecosystem in which invertebrates filled the roles of hunter, scavenger, and prey. Flying insects, particularly those related to Meganeura, ruled the upper canopy. Their flight was powerful but not agile by modern standards. The structure of their wings suggests that their movement was more glider-like, taking advantage of the thick atmosphere and large wing surface area. These insects may have launched themselves from high perches, catching thermals and coasting long distances across the forest. Once airborne, their size alone would have discouraged all but the most daring predators. In contrast, the forest floor hosted an entirely different drama. Millipede-like creatures such as Arthropleura shared space with massive early cockroaches and scuttling silverfish. These creatures fed on the endless carpet of fallen plant material, digesting cellulose and playing a vital role in the breakdown of organic matter. Their waste, in turn, enriched the soil, feeding the roots of the towering club moss trees. It was a tightly knit loop of ecological interaction, and the insects were at the center of it all. The plant life of the Carboniferous deserves further attention, for it was not just the backdrop to this age of insects, it was their architect. Trees, such as lepidodendron, sometimes called scale trees, grew straight and tall with little branching. Their trunks were covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars, and they reproduced by spores, not seeds. This method of reproduction was better suited to the moist, dense environment of Carboniferous swamps, where water carried spores across the forest floor. Unlike the slow-growing trees of today, lepidodendron grew rapidly and died young, sometimes in less than a few decades. Beneath the surface of bogs and peat beds, enormous networks of roots wove together to stabilize the ground. These roots supported not only the trees, but created shelter for insects, amphibians, and other small animals. Insects adapted to these microhabitats, with some developing flattened bodies to squeeze beneath bark or tunnel into rotting wood. Others evolved camouflage that mimicked the surface of tree trunks or leaf litter, blending seamlessly into the forest floor to escape predators or ambush prey. The ecological roles played by insects extended even further. Pollination, although primitive in this era, may have had its roots in the Carboniferous. Some insect-plant interactions, though not as specialized as in the age of flowering plants, still influenced plant reproduction and dispersal. Insects carried spores on their bodies or disturbed leaf structures in ways that aided in spore release. These early interactions foreshadowed the highly evolved pollination systems of later eras. Meanwhile, the carbon cycle of the Carboniferous was deeply influenced by the activities of insects. As they decomposed plant matter and contributed to nutrient cycling, they helped trap large amounts of carbon in the form of buried plant material. This accumulation of biomass under oxygen swamp conditions prevented full decomposition, leading to the formation of coal over geological timescales. The same insects that thrived on decaying vegetation contributed indirectly to the fossil fuels that would one day power human civilization. Among the lesser-known giants of this era were orthopteran ancestors, primitive relatives of crickets and grasshoppers. These insects had powerful hind legs and likely produced sound by rubbing their wings or legs together, an early form of stridulation. While no fossil can preserve sound itself, structural adaptations hint at communication through vibrations and resonance. In a world where birds had yet to sing, it may have been the insects who filled the forests with the first rhythmic songs of life. Despite their dominance, these giants faced pressures of their own. Climate fluctuations, wildfires, and changes in sea levels continually reshaped their habitats. There is evidence of regional extinctions followed by radiations as some species adapted and others vanished. Insect wings adapted to different wind patterns and air densities, and body sizes fluctuated in response to changing oxygen levels. Evolution was always at work, sculpting form from necessity and behavior from opportunity. Predatory insects, like some of the large dragonflies, had visual systems finely tuned for movement. Their compound eyes provided a mosaic view of the world, capable of detecting motion in all directions. This gave them a formidable edge in both hunting and evading threats. Fossils show large eye lobes and well-developed flight musculature, suggesting that sensory processing and response times were already highly developed by this point in evolutionary history. On the darker side of the ecosystem, scavengers cleaned the dead and dying. Giant cockroaches and their kin fed on decomposing animals, leaf litter, and even fecal matter. These insects played a key role in maintaining forest health by preventing the buildup of decaying organic material. Their ability to survive on a variety of substances made them resilient, and their lineage would persist long after the reign of the giants ended. Not all insects of this age were gigantic. Many remained small, occupying the hidden corners of the ecosystem, under bark, inside rotting logs, or within the folds of leaves. Their small size allowed them to exploit resources inaccessible to larger species. They coexisted with their massive relatives, forming a diverse and interdependent community. Insects were not simply large or small, predator or prey. They were every role at once, and together, they wove the fabric of this ancient forest world. By the end of the Carboniferous, signs of change were beginning to appear. Tectonic shifts, gradual cooling, and fluctuating oxygen levels hinted at a coming transformation. But for now, the skies were still filled with wings. The trees still trembled with antennae and legs, and the earth belonged to the invertebrates. This was their golden age. The Carboniferous forests were not only alive with vast plant growth and teeming insect populations, they were dynamic systems shaped by water, fire, and geological transformation. Beneath the colossal lepidodon trees, the undergrowth shimmered with moisture. Fungi sprouted on decomposing logs, and clouds of spores drifted silently through shafts of filtered sunlight. In this deep, mossy silence, insects played roles. More complex than mere creatures of instinct, they were ecosystem engineers, population regulators, and agents of evolutionary experimentation. The aquatic environments of the Carboniferous were especially important in shaping the life cycles of many insects. Ponds, slow-moving streams, and swampy wetlands were the birthplaces of countless larvae, just as they are for many modern species today. But the scale was different. Ponds the size of modern lakes were bordered not by grass, but by towering horsetails and club moss trees. Here, the aquatic nymphs of insects, such as the griffinfly Meganeuropsis permiana, a close relative of Meganeura, would emerge and develop over months or even years. These aquatic larvae, equipped with strong jaws and external gills, likely preyed on small fish and amphibians, ruling the watery underworld with as much dominance as their winged forms did. The skies? Some insects were fully aquatic, while others used water only for part of their life cycle. Mayfly ancestors, for instance, may have evolved the earliest forms of synchronized emergence, where hundreds or thousands of adult insects would rise from the water simultaneously to mate, reproduce, and die in a flurry of wings. This strategy, known as predator satiation, overwhelmed potential threats and ensured the survival of the next generation. Fossil evidence, including mass deposits of adult insect remains and mating pairs preserved in sediment, hint at this ancient reproductive burst that may have filled the air with a surreal haze of fluttering bodies. These reproductive events would have attracted attention. Early amphibians and primitive reptiles, restricted in movement and size, likely gathered at the water's edge to feed on vulnerable insects. In this moment of convergence between species, ecological boundaries blurred. Insects returning to land left behind their aquatic habitats and entered a world increasingly influenced by terrestrial predators, competitive pressures, and new vegetation. Above, in the canopies of dense forest, another layer of insect activity thrived. Some insects developed elongated ovipositors, needle-like structures for laying eggs deep within plant tissue. These adaptations protected developing young from predation and allowed certain species to specialize in very narrow ecological niches. Evolution favored diversity, and over time, some insects began to resemble the leaves, bark, and stems of the plants they depended on. This early camouflage was not a result of mimicry as we understand it today, but of incremental selection for traits that offered even slight survival advantages. Camouflage and defensive adaptations did not stop with appearance. Insects also evolved chemical defenses. Fossilized remains show structural features such as glandular openings, possibly used to secrete foul-tasting or toxic substances. While direct chemical evidence is difficult to retrieve after hundreds of millions of years, trace fossils, such as bite marks, avoided or partially eaten bodies, suggest that many insects had methods of deterring predation long before modern insect defense systems evolved. In terms of sheer ecological volume, insects far outnumbered any other animal group during the Carboniferous. Estimates based on fossil bed densities suggest that in a square meter of forest floor, hundreds of individuals might be crawling, climbing, or hiding at any moment. This abundance allowed for rapid evolution. Life cycles were short, reproduction was prolific, and mutations spread quickly. If a trait allowed even a marginal increase in survival or reproduction, it could become dominant in just a few generations. Such evolutionary flexibility led to astonishing innovations. Wings, which may have originally evolved from gill-like structures or gliding appendages, became highly specialized. Some insects had two pairs of wings that beat in perfect synchronization, while others evolved decoupled wings capable of independent movement for greater maneuverability. Certain species developed asymmetrical wing shapes that allowed them to hover or turn rapidly in flight, features long before seen in modern bees or hummingbirds. These developments occurred in tandem with changes in the Earth itself. Tectonic activity reshaped coastlines, raised mountain ranges, and split swamp basins. As the Carboniferous neared its end, the gradual formation of the supercontinent Pangaea began altering global climates. Regions that were once humid and lush began too dry, swamps retreated. Sea levels fluctuated. These changes placed increasing stress on the ecosystems that had supported giant insects for millions of years. The high oxygen levels that once sustained large insect bodies also began to decline. The reasons remain complex, but involve both the burial of vast amounts of carbon in the form of coal and the rise of new plant types with deeper root systems that transformed nutrient cycling and soil composition. As atmospheric oxygen levels dropped from their Carboniferous peaks, the ability of large insects to maintain sufficient internal oxygen pressure decreased. This would eventually lead to a general reduction in insect body size, one of the most dramatic biological contractions in the planet's history. But before that decline, the Carboniferous offered a final burst of insect diversity and experimentation. Among the most fascinating were the Protothoptera, primitive ancestors to grasshoppers, and stick insects. These creatures exhibited features such as chewing mouthparts, long antennae, and early forms of leg adaptations that hinted at future jumping or climbing abilities. Their fossils are often found alongside early seed ferns, suggesting close ecological relationships, possibly even early herbivory strategies more advanced than spore collection or sap-sucking. Another group, the Polyodixioptans, continued to diversify and refine their three-wing pairs. With their beak-like mouthparts, they may have pioneered new feeding strategies, including piercing into plant tissues or perhaps even early forms of predation. Their flight patterns, aided by fossilized impressions in fine lakebed silt, indicate rapid wing beats and gliding abilities, a level of aerial control not seen again until millions of years later. In this increasingly crowded ecosystem, the interactions between species grew more complex. Competition for food, shelter, and breeding sites led to more refined behaviors. Fossilized burrows and nests reveal the early signs of social or communal behaviors, with insects sharing space or constructing environments to protect their young. While true insect sociality, such as the eusocial hives of ants and bees, was still far in the future, the seeds of cooperation may have begun in these shadowed forests. Across the globe, regional variations in climate and geography created distinct insect communities. Fossils from what are now Scotland, Germany, and the eastern United States all show different dominant species, indicating that the insect reign was not uniform, but a tapestry of localized dominance. In one region, giant millipedes might have been the top decomposers. In another, beetle-like forms or winged predators might have dominated. The global picture was one of variation within grandeur. Yet, despite the differences, one element united all corners of the Carboniferous insect world: a reliance on the intricate relationship between land, air, plant, and creature. Insects were both shaped by and shapers of their environment. They pollinated, consumed, decomposed, and recycled. They hunted and were hunted. And they soared, massive and confident, through skies that had never known the beat of vertebrate wings. As the Carboniferous period advanced toward its final stages, the towering forests and rich, damp ecosystems continued to support the extraordinary scale and diversity of insect life. This was a time when the rhythm of evolution was quickened by abundant resources and relative ecological freedom. The giants of the insect world, from Meganeura to Arthroplura, thrived in environments with little resistance. But even in this golden era, change was in motion. The landscape beneath their wings and legs was not static. Continental collisions, atmospheric shifts, and biological innovation pressed forward slowly, silently reshaping the world beneath these titans. The Carboniferous forest was an evolutionary crucible, a place where form, function, and adaptation collided in unending cycles. The thick undergrowth, spongy with peat and tangled roots, offered a multitude of microhabitats for invertebrates. Soil horizons teemed with life. There were insects adapted for burrowing through wet loam, others that specialized in decaying bark or rotting spores, and those that glided between the mosses and ferns in silent bursts. Some even lived within the water-filled crevices of decaying tree trunks, transforming puddles into aquatic nurseries. This diversity was not just in body form, but also in behavior and life cycle complexity. Insects of the Carboniferous often displayed metamorphosis, either partial or complete. Nymphs and larvae, adapted to different environments than their adult forms, avoided competition with their mature counterparts. For instance, a predatory aquatic larva could transform into an aerial adult with very different prey and survival strategies. This separation of ecological roles across life stages allowed insects to dominate multiple layers of the environment simultaneously. Some insects developed elaborate courtship rituals, leaving behind evidence in the form of fossilized wing structures shaped to produce sound. These were not random shapes, but finely evolved tools for generating vibration or resonance. The first, insect music, though never heard by human ears, may have reverberated through the Carboniferous forests, simple, rhythmic, and repeated through countless generations. As the ecological web grew more intricate, plants and insects became deeply interdependent. Although true flowering plants had not yet evolved, many Carboniferous flora required assistance with spore dispersal or benefited from disturbance by insects. Insects moving across spore-producing organs may have carried fine dustings of reproductive material, inadvertently aiding in reproduction. Some insects with hairy bodies or branched limbs were particularly well-suited to this role, even if the process remained a primitive precursor to modern pollination. Defensive strategies continue to evolve in parallel. As predation by amphibians and other insects increased, insects developed tougher exoskeletons, warning colors, and noxious secretions. Fossils of some beetle-like insects show thickened elytra, which may have served as armor against attacks from claws or jaws. Others had large false eyes on their wings to frighten potential threats, a pattern still seen in moths today. Mimicry, deception, and chemical warfare were all in their earliest forms, quietly scripting the evolutionary arms races that would define the coming ages. The climate, too, began to write new chapters. The Earth experienced periods of glaciation, particularly near the southern pole of the supercontinent Gondwana. These glacial intervals affected global sea levels, causing them to fall and rise unpredictably. Swamps and wetlands dried up in some regions, only to be flooded again later. This rhythmic change in hydrology disrupted the stable habitats that many insects had come to depend on. While some species adapted quickly, others vanished. The fossil record shows extinction events within specific groups, even as others radiated. To fill the gaps, in regions unaffected by glaciation, new opportunities emerged. Insects began to colonize drier environments, testing the boundaries of survival beyond the safety of swamp and bog. Wingless insects became more common in rocky uplands, and those with hardened bodies and minimal water loss began to thrive in increasingly arid forests. These adaptations hinted at the future resilience of insects, a flexibility that would allow them to endure through nearly every planetary catastrophe to come. Alongside insects, other arthropods evolved in response to the shifting environment. Early scorpions and spiders, relatives of insects, though not true insects themselves, took on larger roles in the forest floor's predator-prey dynamics. Fossils of these arachnids reveal body sizes much larger than most modern species, with some scorpions reaching lengths of over 50 centimeters. They hunted among leaf litter, under logs, and in shallow burrows, adding pressure to the insect populations and further shaping their evolution. At the same time, the air itself was changing. The once flourishing oxygen levels began to wane. While still above modern concentrations, the decline was steady enough to affect insect physiology. Fossils of later Carboniferous insects show a slight decrease in maximum size, particularly among aerial species. The decrease in atmospheric oxygen likely reduced the efficiency of passive gas exchange, setting new constraints on how large flying insects could grow. On the forest floor, where the need for rapid oxygenation was less critical, some terrestrial insects and arthropods maintained their large size a little longer. The end of the Carboniferous approached with quiet but persistent upheaval. Forests began to fragment. Coal-forming swamps dried in some regions, replaced by fern-rich meadows or barren highlands. New plant types, such as early conifers and seed ferns, spread across the landscape. These plants reproduced by seeds rather than spores and were better adapted to drier climates. Their arrival marked a shift in plant insect dynamics, as insects developed new ways of feeding on tougher, less moisture-dependent foliage. The rise of seeds also signaled changes in reproductive timing and insect behavior. Insects began to evolve strategies that matched the slower, more deliberate cycles of seed-based plants. Longer lifespans, more selective feeding, and seasonal activity patterns became more common. This transition, gradual and uneven, further eroded the dominance of the swamp-bound giants and ushered in a new evolutionary era. Still, the legacy of Carboniferous insects lingered. Their fossils remain among the most well-preserved of all. Prehistoric invertebrates, thanks to the fine-grained sediments of ancient lakes and coal beds. These fossils capture the intricate venation of wings, the segmentation of antennae, even the faint impressions of compound eyes. They are snapshots of a time when the world breathed heavier and life took on proportions that today seem fantastical. In every fossilized wingbeat and buried carapace lies a reminder of what the Earth once allowed and how it gradually reined that ambition back. The sky had opened for the insects, and they filled it with silence and motion, weaving through the filtered light like organic kites. Their world, wet and wild, was sculpted by moisture and shaped by air. They were the first lords of flight, the earliest to master the vertical axis of life. Though their age was waning, the innovations they sparked would carry forward. Insect, flight, metamorphosis, chemical defense, camouflage. These traits were not extinguished with the giants, but rather inherited, refined, and expanded upon. In this way, the spirit of the Carboniferous endured even as its forests fell and its giants disappeared. As the Carboniferous period drew to a close, the Earth's biosphere began to tighten its grip on what had once been a loosely balanced system. Insects for tens of millions of years had been the undisputed masters of terrestrial and aerial realms. Their numbers, diversity, and dominance had been unrivaled. But change, slow, creeping, unrelenting, was reshaping the landscape beneath their feet and the air through which they soared. The world was transitioning into the Permian, and with it came a fundamental shift in climate, vegetation, atmosphere, and competition. The curtain was beginning to fall on the age of giant insects. The forests that had once spread in near unbroken green across entire continents were thinning. Swampy lowlands that had produced the immense coal beds of the future were drying, sometimes permanently. Seasonal droughts grew longer, and wet periods became less predictable. What was once an environment saturated with moisture was now interrupted by regions of relative dryness. And in this patchwork landscape, the biological advantages of size became liabilities. The insects that had dominated the Carboniferous with size and strength began to falter. Large-bodied species, particularly those reliant on high atmospheric oxygen to meet the demands of respiration, found themselves increasingly at odds with the new environmental pressures. Oxygen concentrations were slowly falling, descending from their Carboniferous peak of around 35% toward the modern level. For small animals with passive respiratory systems, this decline had outsized consequences. The tracheal networks that once delivered abundant oxygen could no longer meet the metabolic demands of enormous wings and massive musculature. Flight, which had once lifted the meganeura above the canopy in silence, became more energetically expensive. The margins of maneuverability narrowed. These great aerial predators, perhaps once invulnerable, began to lose their supremacy. The fossil record from this transitional time begins to reflect a shift. Smaller species of insects, more compact and efficient, began to emerge. These were organisms built not for domination, but for survival. Simultaneously, the plant life that had once sheltered and fed these giants was changing. Seed ferns and early gymnosperms began to overtake the vast spore-producing forests. These new plants were more drought-resistant, slower growing, and more conservative in their energy use. Insects that had evolved to exploit the vast quantities of decaying plant material in swamp environments now had fewer options. The complexity of the food web was reduced, and many of the symbiotic relationships that had flourished in the past began to disintegrate. Yet, even amid this decline, evolution did not pause. If anything, the challenges of the changing world spurred a new phase of insect innovation. Some species developed more efficient spirochelar control, allowing them to regulate gas exchange better under lower oxygen conditions. Others minimize body mass or reduced wing area to conserve energy. While the age of giants was fading, it was not a collapse but a transformation. A leaner, more resilient insect class was beginning to assert itself. Fossils from the early Permian reveal new ecological strategies. Certain insects began laying eggs in protective cases to withstand dry conditions. Some developed hardened bodies that could resist desiccation. Predatory insects became faster and more agile rather than larger. There was a movement away from brute force and toward specialization. The new insect world was one of strategy, not strength. Even among the arthropods that did not technically belong to the insect class, changes were underway. Arthropleura vanished from the record, likely unable to cope with the dual pressures of atmospheric change and habitat loss. Its enormous size and reliance on moist environments had left it vulnerable, and as the swamps disappeared, so did the pathways through which it could move and feed. Meanwhile, terrestrial vertebrates, once small and ecologically limited, began to rise. Early amniotes, ancestors of reptiles and mammals, were becoming more numerous and more capable. They could lay eggs on land, breathe air with lungs rather than tracheal tubes, and move efficiently over dry terrain. These animals began to intrude upon niches that insects had once held exclusively. Where once the insect world had no challengers, now it faced a new class of competitor, warm-blooded, mobile, and adaptive. The fossil record of the late Carboniferous and early Permian reveals traces of interaction between these rising vertebrates and declining insect giants. Small reptilian trackways found near insect burrows suggest predation or scavenging. Some fossils contain partially digested insect remains within the stomach cavities of primitive reptiles. These encounters mark the early stages of a profound shift in ecological power. Still, insects endured. While the giants fell, smaller insects diversified. The number of ecological roles filled by insects increased rather than diminished. New pollinators, seed predators, leaf miners, and decomposers evolved to navigate the changing botanical landscape. Their bodies were lighter, wings faster, life cycles more synchronized with the seasons. They adapted to forests, to grasslands, and eventually to deserts. It was not extinction, but evolution in motion. Among the enduring legacies of the Carboniferous were the foundational forms of insect architecture. Fossilized nests, tunnels, and feeding galleries from this period show that insects had begun modifying their environment in structured, deliberate ways. These early behaviors laid the groundwork for the insect societies of later eras. Though social insects like ants and termites would not rise until much later, the blueprint for group living, division of labor, and environmental control was already being sketched. Another key inheritance was insect flight. Despite the extinction of the largest flyers, the mechanics of powered flight remained. The air had once belonged to the dragonflies, but it now opened to smaller, more efficient flyers. Early relatives of the mayfly, the caddisfly, the true dragonfly. These lineages refined the art of aerial movement, becoming the ancestors of many of the insects that still grace modern skies. The disappearance of the giants was not dramatic. There was no singular event, no asteroid or sudden freeze. Instead, it was the gradual erosion of conditions that had once made such size feasible. Rising mountains altered weather patterns. Falling oxygen made respiration more difficult. The collapse of the swamp forests removed both food and shelter. And slowly, over the course of millions of years, the skies grew quieter. Yet the genetic echoes of those ancient titans remain. The dragonflies of today, though smaller, still carry the same basic wing structures as their Carboniferous ancestors. Beetles still wear the protective shells first hardened in that long-forgotten age. Crickets still rub legs to sing, as they may have done beneath the towering scale trees. The insects of the present are not merely descendants, they are living. Fossils, carriers of a biological memory written in wings and exoskeletons. In every buzzing garden and humid jungle, in every pond and patch of moss, the story continues. It began over 300 million years ago, when Earth's sky first opened to creatures not born to fly. In that ancient silence, they rose, not with feathers or leathered wings, but with rigid chitin and delicate veins. They wrote the first chapters of flight, of metamorphosis, of environmental engineering. And even though their great age has passed, their influence has never waned. The echoes of the Carboniferous forest still rustle beneath the surface of today's ecosystems. Though the giant insects are long gone, their reign carved deep grooves in the evolutionary landscape, shaping not only their descendants, but the very structure of ecosystems that would follow. The transition into the Permian period marked not an end, but a metamorphosis, an unfolding of new possibilities in form, function, and adaptation. The natural world was becoming more complex, and the insect class, with its ancient lineage and flexible architecture, adapted once again to remain a central player in the web of life. As new environmental pressures took hold, evolutionary divergence accelerated. Insects began to specialize further, their bodies shrinking in some cases, but becoming more efficient, more refined. No longer was gigantism the path to dominance. Instead, survival hinged on energy conservation, reproductive flexibility, and habitat exploitation. Some insects adopted cryptic coloration to blend seamlessly with the evolving vegetation. Others developed burrowing behaviors to escape aridity or evade predators that were now better adapted to terrestrial hunting. The ability to exploit vertical space remained a key advantage. In the emerging Permian forests, shorter, more scattered, and increasingly dominated by seed-producing plants, insects with climbing and gliding adaptations retained dominance in the arboreal layers. From the bark-dwelling beetle to the winged seed mimics, insects occupied niches from the soil to the canopy, finding sustenance in seeds, spores, and the decaying remnants of the old swamp flora. Predator-prey dynamics were also shifting. Amphibians, once confined to moist lowlands, now began venturing further from water. Some evolved tougher skins and more efficient lungs, reducing their reliance on aquatic habitats. These changes were mirrored by insects, whose own defensive strategies became more sophisticated. Structural modifications like reinforced thoraxes and serrated limbs appeared, offering both protection and offense. Insects also began experimenting with behavioral adaptations, nocturnal activity, sudden jumps, and erratic flight paths to confuse and evade their new predators. As the Permian climate trended toward aridity, the expansion of deserts and seasonal dry zones created even greater pressures. Insects that could withstand water scarcity thrived. These included early relatives of modern-day silverfish and springtails, tiny, moisture-sensitive organisms that managed to persist by living in shaded crevices, under stones, and within damp soil layers. Their success in marginal habitats ensured that even as environments changed drastically, insects remained nearly omnipresent. The success of these more conservative forms of insects was mirrored by the evolutionary appearance of new groups. The ancestors of modern beetles began to develop hardened forewings, or elytra, which protected their flight wings and bodies from desiccation and mechanical damage. This adaptation allowed them to live in more exposed environments without losing the ability to fly. Over time, beetles diversified into an astonishing array of forms and ecological roles, many of which persist unchanged to this day. Fossil beds from the early to mid-Permian reveal early true bugs, members of the Hemiptera with piercing, sucking mouthparts specialized for feeding on plant sap. This was a major innovation. While earlier insects primarily fed on spores, decaying matter, or prey, these new forms tapped directly into the nutrient systems of living plants. Their emergence marked a critical point in the coevolutionary arms race between insects and vegetation, one that would reach its height with flowering. Plants much later in the Mesozoic. Even more intriguing were the early signs of social cooperation among some insect groups. Though true eusociality, the kind seen in ants, bees, and termites, would not evolve until the age of dinosaurs, certain Permian insect fossils show evidence of communal nesting sites and brood care. Parallel burrows containing clusters of juvenile stages suggest that some insects were beginning to exhibit non-solitary behavior. Such cooperation, while limited in scope, signaled a profound evolutionary advantage, setting the stage for later social complexity. Despite these innovations, the Permian was a time of escalating environmental volatility. Volcanic activity, tectonic uplift, and fluctuating sea levels destabilized ecosystems. Pangaea's formation created vast continental interiors with extreme climates, hot summers, cold winters, prolonged droughts. Many of the adaptations that insects evolved in response to this harsh new world. Desiccation, resistance, dormant life stages, camouflage, would become permanent features of their lineage. Insects continued to evolve in lockstep with plants. As gymnosperms, like conifers, spread across drier regions, new insect groups appeared with specialized adaptations for consuming tougher plant tissues. Mandibles grew stronger, digestive enzymes more effective, and behavioral strategies more nuanced. Some insects became seed predators, burrowing into developing cones to feed on soft inner tissues. Others exploited the resinous sap of conifers, developing adaptations to avoid entrapment and chemical irritation. It was during this age of tension and transition that true holometabolic metamorphosis, complete transformation from larva to pupa to adult, emerged. This allowed insects to exploit entirely separate habitats and food sources at different life stages. Larvae could tunnel through wood or soil, consuming detritus or roots, while adults fed on leaves, flowers, or other insects. This separation dramatically reduced intraspecific competition and promoted greater ecological flexibility. It also allowed for rapid diversification as life stages evolved independently to suit changing conditions. Fossil sites across Russia, China, and South America from this time reveal a mosaic of insect evolution. Wing shapes diversified, mouthparts adapted to new plant defenses, and body structures became more compact and modular. Insects that could burrow survived the dry spells. Those with efficient flight escaped fire and predation. And through it, all insects remained foundational to food webs, both as consumers of organic matter and as prey for a growing host of terrestrial vertebrates. The skies, once ruled by Meganeura and its relatives, now hosted smaller but no less agile insects. The air still hummed, not with the slow, heavy beat of giant wings, but with quick darts, sharp turns, and hovering precision. Dragonflies adapted, surviving through smaller species with greater flight control. Mayflies developed synchronized emergence strategies tied to seasonal rhythms. Caddisflies began building protective cases for their aquatic larvae, using sand, twigs, and even tiny shells, a glimpse of the intricate engineering behavior that insects would carry into the future. As ecosystems continued to shift, insects became essential to ecological recovery after localized disasters. Following floods, fires, or volcanic activity, it was often the insects who returned first, breaking down charred vegetation, aerating the soil, and kick-starting the cycle of life once more. Their resilience, adaptability, and rapid reproductive cycles made them the quiet healers of the land. By the late Permian, the insect world was a far cry from its Carboniferous grandeur. The giants had vanished, but in their place stood legions of smaller, sharper, and more efficient organisms. Their evolutionary toolkit had expanded, their behaviors refined, and their habitats diversified. From canopy to cave, pond to plain, insects had infiltrated nearly every ecological space on Earth. And yet, the true test of their resilience had not yet arrived. On the horizon loomed the greatest extinction event the planet would ever face. A cataclysm that would wipe out over 90% of marine species and a significant portion of terrestrial life. But even then, in the face of fire, flood, and silence, the insects would endure. As the Permian period deepened, the Earth approached a precipice. Subtle shifts in atmospheric composition, temperature regulation, and ocean chemistry began to ripple outward, triggering disruptions across ecosystems on land and sea. The insects, which had evolved with almost mythological resilience since their emergence hundreds of millions of years earlier, were again confronted with planetary-scale challenges. But unlike the slow transformations of the Carboniferous Permian transition, what lay ahead was a rapid global upheaval, the end Permian mass extinction, often called the Great Dying. Long before that final event unfurled, however, insects continued to expand into new roles and fill increasingly complex ecological niches. In the drying forests and grasslands, members of the Coleoptera, true beetles, became more diverse and robust. Their hardened elytra-protected delicate flight wings, and many adopted nocturnal habits to avoid extreme daytime heat. They fed on decaying organic matter, bored into wood, and exploited fungi. In the underground realm, their larvae carved silent tunnels through roots and humus, forming an invisible, essential network of decomposition and nutrient recycling. Above ground, the true bugs Hemiptera continued their diversification. Their piercing mouthparts evolved into instruments capable of extracting not just sap from gymnosperms, but also bodily fluids from other insects. Predatory species emerged, marking a new layer in the insect food web where insects consumed other insects with surgical precision. These were not the large, lumbering predators of the Carboniferous skies, but sleek, precise hunters armed with speed and sensory refinement. Across the landscape, behavioral evolution accelerated. Insects responded to environmental unpredictability by refining reproductive strategies. Many developed egg-laying behaviors tied to temperature, moisture, or the availability of food. Some buried eggs in protective soil capsules. Others deposited them in bark crevices or on the undersides of leaves. A few began guarding their eggs, a rare form of parental investment in a group often defined by reproductive volume over care. Simultaneously, the interaction between insects and plants intensified. Gymnosperms like conifers, cycads, and ginkgos became dominant, offering new forms of foliage and reproductive structures. Insects evolved to navigate their resinous surfaces, their stiff needles, and their tough seeds. Feeding strategies became more precise, often targeting specific tissues, such as pollen-producing cones or new growth tips. Mouthparts and sensory organs adapted accordingly, giving rise to new insect lineages capable of exploiting these innovations in plant biology. One of the most important evolutionary developments of this time was the refinement of complete metamorphosis. Groups such as beetles, flies, and early moth-like insects Lepidoptera began to perfect the process of transforming fully from larva to pupa to adult. This evolutionary leap not only minimized competition between life stages, but allowed for unparalleled ecological plasticity. Larvae could burrow, graze, or scavenge with worm-like efficiency, while adults could fly, mate, and disperse. It was a division of labor on a biological level, a mechanism that allowed these insects to thrive in unstable, fragmenting ecosystems. In the fossil record, this period reveals a striking increase in insect diversity, not just in terms of species numbers, but in structural and behavioral adaptations. Wing venation patterns diversified. Limb morphology split between specialized digging, grasping, or swimming appendages. Antennae branched into feathery or clubbed forms, each tuned to specific environmental cues such as chemical trails, temperature changes, or vibration. Despite these advancements, a shadow loomed. Volcanic activity in what is now Siberia began to intensify. Gigantic lava flows, known as the Siberian traps, erupted over millions of square kilometers, releasing vast amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. These gases disrupted climate patterns, triggered acid rain, and destabilized the ocean's chemistry. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans declined. Temperatures soared. The biosphere began to falter. For insects, the consequences were indirect but devastating. The plants they depended on began to decline or disappear in some regions. As food webs collapsed, even the most adaptable species found themselves exposed to starvation, desiccation, and loss of breeding habitat. Insects that had once flourished in specific ecological corridors now faced barren landscapes and erratic climate patterns. Fossil evidence from this time reveals sharp drops in diversity among certain insect groups, especially those that had specialized in no-vanishing habitats. And yet, unlike many other life forms, insects did not succumb completely. While over 90% of marine species and a majority of terrestrial vertebrates were driven to extinction by the end Permian event, many insect lineages survived. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and ability to enter dormant states helped buffer them from the worst environmental shocks. Some entered diapause, suspended development in response to environmental stress. Others retreated underground or into shaded microhabitats. By the time the worst of the extinction had passed, the face of the Earth was unrecognizable. Forests had vanished from vast areas. Wetlands had turned to dust. The intricate food webs of the Paleozoic had collapsed. But the insects remained, reduced in diversity, perhaps, but not extinguished. In the silence that followed the collapse, the first buzzes and wing beats of recovery belonged to them. As new ecosystems began to emerge in the early Triassic, insects re-radiated into the empty niches. The survivors became founders of the future. The ancestors of modern beetles diversified rapidly, exploiting a fresh wave of decomposing matter and early resprouting plant life. True flies began their evolutionary rise, developing flight mechanisms far more agile than those of any previous insect group. And among the earliest signs of flowering plant-like structures, some primitive pollinator relationships may have already begun to form. The insects that emerged from the Great Dying were no longer giants. Their power lay not in size, but in adaptability. They were smaller, lighter, and more efficient. They moved with the wind, burrowed into bark, skimmed across the surface of water, and rode the rising thermals of a planet beginning to rebuild. They fed on the first green shoots on the carcasses of the dead and on each other. And from this chaos, they gave rise to the modern insect world, a lineage that would eventually surpass all others in both biomass and biological diversity. With the Triassic sun warming new soils, the groundwork was laid for the next major chapter in insect evolution. Flying reptiles, flowering plants, and even the ancestors of mammals and birds would one day rely on the stability, resilience, and ecological service of insects. But before any of that, it was these quiet survivors who filled the silence left behind by mass extinction. Their legacy, rooted in the Carboniferous sky and tested in the Permian inferno, continue not just through time, but into every corner of the Earth. Insects had not just survived, they had been tempered by fire and honed by pressure. And as the world moved on, they would be there still, quietly rewriting the terms of survival. In the first light of the Triassic dawn, the Earth was scarred, empty, and eerily quiet. Forests had been reduced to ash fields. Swamps had dried into cracked mud. Coral reefs, once alive with motion, were now fossil graveyards beneath acidic waves. The largest extinction in Earth's history had left behind a world with few survivors. And yet, among the ruins, insects stirred, though diminished. They endured reassembling life systems from the fragmented pieces of a broken biosphere. Their resilience came not from strength or dominance, but from scale, simplicity, and subtlety. Insects had no lungs, yet they breathed. They bore no maternal care, yet they reproduced in vast numbers. They had no centralized brain as mammals do, yet they responded with precision to changes in light, pressure, and scent. Their bodies were crafted by eons of experimentation, forged in swamps, refined in drought, and now tested by silence. In the aftermath of extinction, these qualities became their advantage. The earliest Triassic ecosystems were not lush or abundant. They were lean, often inhospitable, and punctuated by environmental extremes, where vertebrates were slow to return. In numbers, insects reappeared quickly, first as scavengers and detritivores, cleaning the forest floor of death and decay. In the absence of rich foliage, they consumed dead wood, fungi, and even each other. Beetles became central to this phase of recovery. Fossil records indicate that wood-boring beetles were among the first to diversify again, burrowing into dead trunks and releasing nutrients back into the soil. From this decayed biomass, mosses and ferns began to reclaim the land. With them came herbivorous insects adapted to scraping, rasping, and chewing new growth. Their mouthparts honed through millions of years allowed for swift adaptation to the slowly re-establishing plant life. Many were generalists, feeding on a variety of tissues, while others began to specialize once again, setting in motion the slow regrowth of ecological relationships. In time, predators followed. Not large ones, but insects themselves, re-establishing complex food webs within their own class. Assassins, ambushers, and flyers all returned. True bugs with piercing mouthparts hunted soft-bodied larvae. Early lacewings emerged with their lacy, transparent wings and voracious appetites. Dragonfly relatives reclaimed the skies, not as giants, but as elegant, darting hunters capable of catching prey mid-air with astonishing precision. They were aerodynamic, efficient, and small, ideally suited for the thin, dry air of the new Earth. Amid this resurgence, the environment was evolving toward a new trajectory. The supercontinent Pangaea dominated global geography, stretching from pole to pole. Its interior was vast and arid, with seasonal rains but prolonged droughts. Insects adapted accordingly, some like early orthopterans, relatives of grasshoppers. And katydids developed powerful hind legs for jumping, allowing them to cover wide distances in search of food or mates. Others evolved waxy cuticles to reduce water loss or became nocturnal to escape the heat. Reproductive strategies diversified as well. Many insects developed reproductive cycles tied to environmental cues like temperature and humidity. Egg diapause, a suspended state of development during harsh conditions, became more common. This allowed insects to wait out dry seasons or even years of unfavorable weather, emerging only when moisture and warmth returned. These strategies meant that even if adult populations collapsed, eggs could remain hidden in soil or bark, ready to hatch when the world allowed. A significant development during this time was the rise of the earliest ancestors of flies. Small, agile, and incredibly adaptable. The Diptera would go on to become one of the most diverse and ecologically influential insect orders. But even in their early forms, they demonstrated extraordinary flight control. Unlike dragonflies, which used all four wings for lift, flies began evolving to functional wings with the rear pair reduced to small stabilizers or halters for balance. This innovation allowed for unmatched aerial maneuverability, allowing them to hover, dart, and pivot mid-flight with unmatched agility. As ecosystems stabilized, the bond between insects and plants began to deepen once more. Though flowering plants had not yet evolved, gymnosperms dominated the plant kingdom, producing cones, seeds, and resin. Insects adapted to exploit these structures. Some developed specialized legs and antennae for manipulating cones. Others evolved resistance to the sticky sap that ensnared predators. The resin, while defensive, also preserved many of these early interactions, capturing insects mid-movement, creating amber fossils that remain among the most detailed windows into prehistoric life. In the leaf litter, early ant-like forms began to appear. Though not true ants, these insects showed signs of social organization, living in clusters, sharing food sources, and even displaying coordinated movement. The groundwork for sociality was being laid. The advantages of cooperation, shared defense, brood care, food storage, would eventually give rise to some of the most successful life forms in Earth's history. But for now, they remained scattered hints of what was to come. Insects once again began to reclaim the canopy. As trees returned in more significant numbers, new species evolved to live in their bark, leaves, and branches. Bark beetles, scale. Insects and early aphid-like creatures tapped into the tree's vascular tissues, forming ancient versions of modern parasitic and mutualistic relationships. Some of these insects may have influenced plant growth by selectively damaging tissues, thus shaping the very architecture of forests. The dance between plant and insect, begun in the shadows of the Carboniferous, continued its ancient rhythm. Beneath the soil, insects transformed the land. Their burrowing and foraging activities broke down leaf litter, aerated the earth, and cycled nutrients. Springtails, primitive hexapods often excluded from the true insect classification, returned, in immense numbers, playing a central role in decomposition and soil health. Though tiny, their impact was monumental. They were part of the quiet engine that allowed ecosystems to recover from devastation. Insect diversity in the Triassic expanded slowly but steadily. Fossils from this period show a marked increase in both form and function. Wings took on new shapes. Legs adapted for swimming, digging, clinging, and jumping emerged across different lineages. Mouthparts became modular, capable of evolving into tools for chewing, slicing, sucking, or filtering. The insect body, with its segmented exoskeleton and decentralized systems, proved to be one of evolution's most adaptable frameworks. As the Triassic moved toward its middle phases, new vertebrates began to appear: early dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and mammals. Yet none of these creatures would surpass insects in number or ecological reach. Insects had long since claimed every niche from canopy to root, from stream to treetop. They pollinated, decomposed, preyed, and were preyed upon. They had no language, but they shaped the very vocabulary of life. They also left traces, fossils, not just of themselves, but of their presence. Leaf surfaces from the Triassic bear signs of insect feeding, parallel rows of chew marks, punctures from piercing mouthparts, galls from eggs laid inside leaf tissues. These silent signatures speak of ancient interactions repeated over generations, etched into stone like whispers from a lost forest. In this world rebuilding itself, insects were not survivors of the past. They were pioneers of the future. Every leap, flutter, and crawl carried the memory of deep time and the promise of continuity. Life in its most ancient and enduring form buzzed, clicked, and climbed onward. The world of the Middle Triassic was beginning to resemble the outlines of modern ecosystems, where once the Earth had smoldered beneath volcanic skies and wandered through years of toxic rain and famine. It now breathed again, slowly, cautiously, but with undeniable momentum. Forests, though sparse, compared to the lushness of the Carboniferous, returned in fragments, and the web of life was slowly rewoven, strand by strand. Amid this recovery, insects flourished, not as the titans of the past, but as diverse, efficient, and deeply embedded players in every corner of the terrestrial world. By this time, the radiation of insect orders had reached remarkable breadth. Lineages that would eventually dominate the world in sheer numbers and influence were now quietly expanding. the ancestors of modern flies, beetles, moths, and true. Bugs evolved novel forms and behaviors that allowed them to exploit a rapidly diversifying plant kingdom. Each structural shift and behavioral refinement added new threads to the complex ecological tapestry. The gymnosperms, still the dominant plants of the time, shaped insect evolution in profound ways. While they lacked flowers and fruit, their cones and pollen grains presented new opportunities. Some insects evolved finely tuned sensory organs to detect pollen, while others developed specialized bristles or mouthparts to gather it. Though true pollination mutualisms would not fully evolve until the appearance of flowering plants in the Cretaceous, primitive associations were already forming. Insects moved from cone to cone in search of food or shelter, occasionally transporting pollen in the process. In this way, the earliest whispers of coevolution between plants and insects could be heard. Fossil evidence from regions such as modern-day Germany, China, and South Africa reveals increasing insect diversity in both form and function, preserved in fine-grained sediments. These fossils show the rise of slender-bodied bugs with elongated mouthparts, primitive beetles with heavily armored wings, and delicate-winged caddisfly relatives whose larvae built tiny protective cases from sand and organic debris. The appearance of such behaviors hinted at a growing ecological sophistication. Insects were no longer simply surviving, they were shaping their environments. In the soil, insect-driven bioturbation helped reconstruct entire ecosystems. Their digging, tunneling, and waste processing activities restructured the earth, enhancing root aeration and nutrient cycling. This allowed plants to take deeper hold and expand their reach. The microcosm of the forest floor, often overlooked in the grandeur of prehistoric life, was in fact a bustling, humming network of cooperation, decomposition, and regrowth, with insects as its engineers. One of the most significant evolutionary leaps during this period was the emergence of new flight strategies. While the ancestral dragonflies had once ruled the Carboniferous skies with brute force and scale, the Triassic saw the development of more nuanced forms of aerial control. True flies, with their single pair of wings and halters, evolved toward astonishing maneuverability. Their ability to hover, bank, and reverse in mid-air allowed them to avoid predators, pursue mates, and locate food with unparalleled finesse. It marked the beginning of insect flight as not just a means of mobility, but as a dominant ecological advantage. Predation, both by and upon insects, also intensified. Early reptiles and amphibians, along with the first mammaliforms, increasingly relied on insects as a primary food source. Insects, in turn, developed more advanced defenses. Camouflage patterns that mimicked twigs, bark, or leaves became common. In certain groups, some developed noxious chemicals as deterrents, stored in specialized glands and released when threatened. Others adopted reflex bleeding, oozing bitter-colored fluids from joints to startle predators. The variety and subtlety of these responses revealed a growing interplay between predator pressure and adaptive design. Even more remarkable were the evolutionary seeds of insect sociality. While still in its early stages, fossilized nests and burrow systems suggested rudimentary group behaviors. Clusters of insect eggs guarded by adult individuals, larvae arranged in communal feeding chambers, and aligned exit tunnels all hinted at the earliest forms of cooperation. These behaviors, though far removed from the complex colonies of future ants or termites, laid foundational patterns for shared living and resource management. In aquatic habitats, too, insects left their mark. Mayfly and stonefly larvae reoccupied streams and lakes, playing essential roles in aquatic food chains. Their presence indicated a level of environmental recovery and stability, as these species were sensitive to pollution and temperature fluctuations. The larval stages scraped algae from rocks, filtered detritus, and served as prey for fish and amphibians, becoming critical links in the reassembled freshwater ecosystems. This resurgence occurred not in isolation, but in a world increasingly populated by other evolving life forms. Archosaurs, the dominant group of vertebrates that would include crocodiles, pterosaurs, and eventually dinosaurs, began to expand into new ecological roles. Some became terrestrial predators, others adapted to semi-aquatic lifestyles. As these vertebrates spread, insects adapted again, changing activity periods, flight timing, and habitat selection to minimize overlap with their new predators. Still, the balance remained fragile. Pangaea's vast interior plains experienced climate extremes, scorching summers and freezing winters that tested insect adaptability. Those species capable of entering dormant stages, burrowing underground, or shifting to nocturnal behaviors stood the best chance of survival. Insects once again proved their evolutionary resilience, not through dominance or grandeur, but through flexibility and innovation. Throughout the Triassic, insect fossil sites grew in frequency and richness. Wing impressions, feeding marks, exoskeleton fragments, and even trace fossils from burrows and oviposition scars painted a picture of resurgence. Insects were not merely surviving, they were setting the rules of engagement for terrestrial ecosystems. Every flight, crawl, or leap served a function, pollinating, decomposing, feeding, or evading. And in doing so, insects quietly wove themselves into the structure of Earth's new biological framework. By the end of the Triassic, as the first true dinosaurs emerged and the planet prepared to step into a new era of biological expansion, insects were already veterans of mass extinction, climate instability, and ecological transformation. Their evolutionary experiments had produced wings, metamorphosis, cooperation, camouflage, venom, music, architecture, and resilience. No other group of animals had achieved such breadth. They were ancient, yet ever new. Fragile, yet indestructible. Small, yet infinitely powerful in shaping ecosystems. And as the age of dinosaurs prepared to unfold, the insects were already there. Waiting in the shadows, riding on the wind, crawling beneath the roots, ready to meet the future once again. The close of the Triassic period marked not only the birth of the dinosaurs, but the culmination of a long and silent victory that had been unfolding beneath leaves, behind tree bark, and in the hidden layers of soil, the triumph of the insects. From the towering rainforests of the Carboniferous to the scarred deserts of the Permian and into the recovering landscapes of the Triassic, insects had evolved through fire, flood, famine, and extinction, refining their forms, behaviors, and life cycles into an almost limitless variety. They had not just survived Earth's greatest cataclysm, they had adapted and flourished within its aftermath, becoming indispensable to every terrestrial system on the planet. By the time dinosaurs took their first thunderous steps across Pangaea, insects had already colonized nearly every available niche. Forest canopy, desert crust, jungle floor, alpine slope, wetland pool, all had become insect territory. No longer enormous in size, insects were instead enormous in influence. Their presence shaped plant evolution, soil chemistry, and the behavior of countless other species. Their scale had shrunk, but their power had grown. Flying insects were now masters of the skies, not through sheer bulk like the ancient Meganeura, but through speed, agility, and coordination. The evolution of flight musculature, compound eyes, and delicate wings had created creatures capable of precision movement in three-dimensional space. Hovering, banking, darting, gliding. These capabilities were not only adaptations for escape and foraging, but formed the backbone of pollination, a process that would reach full bloom in the coming age of flowering plants. Pollination at this stage remained rudimentary. Gymnosperms still dominated. And while some insect species had begun to move pollen incidentally, the intricate mutualisms of the Cretaceous lay millions of years in the future. Even so, the first whispers of that future were present. Certain beetles, small flies, and scaly-winged protomoths were already developing sensory adaptations tuned to plant reproductive structures. They were learning to read the language of cones, scents, and sticky resins, an invisible dialogue between plant and pollinator that would one day ignite an evolutionary explosion. Meanwhile, the evolution of holometabulous metamorphosis had diversified beyond recognition. Beetles hatched as larvae, lived as soil burrowers or wood-eaters, pupated in hidden chambers, and emerged as armored, winged adults. Flies transformed from aquatic maggots into buzzing aerial acrobats. Early wasps developed parasitic behaviors, inserting their eggs into the bodies of other insects, a gruesome yet ecologically crucial innovation that helped regulate insect populations and enabled another tier of specialization. Within the soil, insects became ecosystem architects. Their tunnels filtered water, their castings aerated roots, and their feeding habits cycled nutrients from detritus to living plant tissue. In the canopies, their herbivory sculpted plant growth, driving defensive adaptations like thickened leaves, toxic compounds, and resin channels. Every nibble, burrow, and flight helped create the pressures that would shape the future of terrestrial evolution. The fossil record from the late Triassic confirms the extraordinary reach of insects. Coprolites, fossilized dung, from early reptiles and amphibians are filled with fragments of insect cuticle. Leaf impressions show signs of organized insect feeding, parallel lines from mandibles, spirals from egg-laying borers, and galls from larval development. Amber deposits begin to appear, preserving not only individual insects in exquisite detail, but moments of interaction, tiny dramas frozen in time. A fly caught mid-hover, a beetle scaling a twig, a pair of wings still unfolding from metamorphosis. As more complex vertebrates emerged, the insects adapted again. New sensory systems evolved, capable of detecting vibrations, shifts in air pressure, and chemical traces left by predators. Some developed startle displays, flashing eye spots or bright colors when disturbed. Others produced sounds, clicks, chirps, stridulations, not yet as coordinated as modern cricket songs, but serving as the prototypes of acoustic communication. Sociality, too, began its next phase. Certain cockroach-like insects and wasp ancestors began showing division of labor, shared brood care, and even primitive nest building. These early communities were simple, fragile, and likely short, but they marked a departure from solitary survival. The impulse to share resources, protect young, and organize space would eventually lead to the rise of ant colonies, termite mounds, and beehives, some of the most sophisticated social systems. In the animal kingdom, insects also expanded their interactions with the newly dominant vertebrates. Some became external parasites, feeding on blood or skin. Others began cleaning wounds or feeding on excrement, creating early examples of insect-mediated sanitation. A few even developed mimicry, taking on the colors or shapes of more dangerous creatures to avoid predation. These coevolutionary entanglements grew more complex with each generation, forming a silent web that bound every class of life together. By the dawn of the Jurassic, insects were no longer just passengers in Earth's story. They were co-authors. They had watched continents drift and climates burn, and through it all, they had persisted, evolved, and proliferated. They were ancient, enduring, and profoundly versatile, though their age of visible gigantism had ended long ago. A new form of dominance had emerged, invisible, cumulative, and total. Insects were now the glue of ecosystems, the engineers of change, and the silent architects of the biosphere. They didn't roar or leave bones behind, but they endured. And in their endurance, they carried with them the memory of a time when the skies belonged to giants. Thank you for watching this journey through a forgotten era of Earth's history. If this exploration into the age of giant insects and their incredible evolutionary path has stirred your curiosity or maybe even disrupted your sleep, I deeply apologize, but I hope it was worth the wonder. Please consider liking, sharing, and commenting with your location and local time. We'd love to know where and when you joined us on this ancient voyage. Now, let us guide you into rest. As the insects retreat into shadow and the prehistoric skies quiet once more, the night stretches open before you like the deep stillness of a fossil bed. Close your eyes and let the sounds of Earth's oldest survivors carry you into sleep. Good night.